November 1945, Pittsburgh. 24-year-old Dorothy Harlan stood by the window of her small apartment on Liberty Avenue, watching the cold rain streak down the glass. In her hands, she held a worn leather notebook belonging to her father, Merritt Harlan, a mechanical engineer who had worked at Westinghouse for 28 years. The cover bore a label in faded ink, Technical Calculations, 1940 to 1944. Dorothy opened the first page and saw her father's familiar handwriting, tight loops and precise numerals filling the margins with formulas, sketches, cross-references. Her heart began to pound. She had seen all this before. Not here, though. In the November issue of the Journal of Applied Mechanics, which had arrived in the morning mail. The article was authored by one Silas Drummond, a 47-year-old associate professor at Carnegie Institute of Technology. The same Silas who used to visit her father for coffee every Thursday evening, who would sit in their cramped kitchen nodding along as Merritt explained his theories about stress distribution in welded joints, who would say with that sympathetic smile, "Merritt, you are brilliant, truly brilliant. But who is going to listen to a factory man without a doctorate? The academy does not open its doors to people like us, my friend. You need credentials, publications, connections." Now, Silas had published a paper detailing a novel mathematical model for predicting fatigue failure in multi-layered structural assemblies. The derivations were precise, the methodology elegant, the conclusions groundbreaking. And every formula, every coefficient, every diagram was lifted directly from her father's notebook. Word for word, line for line. Dorothy turned the page and found the exact equation her father had written in March 1941, 4.5 years before the publication date. She recognized the small notation in the margin, a question mark her father had drawn next to a boundary condition he had been uncertain about. That same question mark appeared in Drummond's published diagram. Her fingers trembled as she turned more pages. Every section matched. The derivation of the stress tensor, the integration method for calculating deformation, the experimental validation protocol, all of it stolen. Her father had died a year ago, in November 1944, just as the war in Europe was winding down and Pittsburgh steel mills were running 3 shifts to support the final push. Heart attack, massive and sudden. He had collapsed at his workbench at Westinghouse, surrounded by blueprints and slide rules. He was 53 years old. Dorothy remembered the phone call, the supervisor's voice tight with regret. "Miss Harlan, I am so sorry. Your father was a good man, one of the best engineers we ever had." She remembered the funeral, the small gathering of co-workers and neighbors, the plain casket, her mother Estelle weeping silently beside her. After the funeral, Silas Drummond had come to their apartment with flowers and condolences. He had stood in their narrow hallway with his hat in his hands, his eyes red-rimmed behind thick glasses. "Merritt was my dearest colleague," he had said. "More than a colleague, a friend, a mentor. I learned so much from him. Let me go through his papers, his technical notebooks. I will preserve his legacy. I will make sure his work is recognized. I will write something in his honor, submit it to the journals, make certain the engineering community knows what he accomplished." They had trusted him. They had been grateful for his offer. They had let him take boxes of notebooks and drafts from the apartment, stacked them in his arms, watched him carry them up the stairs to his own flat 1 floor above. Now Dorothy understood. Silas had not preserved anything. He had stolen it all. He had waited until her father was dead, until there was no one to contradict him, and then he had claimed the work as his own. Dorothy closed the notebook and crossed to the small desk wedged between the radiator and the wall. 3 more notebooks were stacked there, the ones she had discovered the previous week in a cardboard box shoved behind the water heater in the basement storage area. Her mother had asked her to look for old winter coats, and Dorothy had found instead these forgotten treasures. Silas probably did not know they existed. Or maybe he simply had not gotten around to taking them. She opened the second notebook. July 1942. Her father had been working on a method for optimizing riveted joints in aircraft fuselages under high-altitude pressure differentials. The war effort had demanded lighter, stronger planes, and her father had been obsessed with finding ways to reduce weight without sacrificing structural integrity. Dorothy remembered him at the kitchen table late at night, hunched over these pages, his coffee growing cold as he worked through iteration after iteration. She opened the third notebook. April 1943. A complete theoretical framework for predicting crack propagation in heat-treated steel. Dorothy remembered now. Silas had presented a paper on exactly that topic at an ASME conference in early 1943, just weeks after this notebook entry. At the time, she had thought nothing of it. Her father had been alive, working long hours at the plant, never complaining, never seeking recognition. He had always said, "The work matters, Dorothy, not the credit. If it helps build a better airplane, a safer bridge, that is enough for me." But now the pattern was unmistakable. Silas had been stealing for years. While Merritt was alive, he had taken carefully, incrementally, always framing it as collaboration, as friendly exchange of ideas between colleagues. After Merritt died, he had grown bold, publishing wholesale theft as original research. Dorothy felt a cold anger settle over her, heavy and clarifying. She was not an engineer like her father. She had not inherited his gift for mathematics, his intuitive understanding of forces and materials. She was a quality inspector at Jones Laughlin Steel, checking tolerances on rolled plate, measuring hardness, signing off on shipments. It was decent work, steady pay, respectable for a young woman. But she was Merritt Harlan's daughter. She had spent her childhood watching him work, listening to him explain the elegant logic of load distribution, the poetry of a well-designed joint. She understood enough to recognize theft when she saw it, and she would not let a thief erase her father's name from history. That evening, Dorothy climbed the stairs to the third floor of the building, one flight above her own apartment. Silas Drummond lived in a cluttered two-bedroom overlooking the alley, a space filled with books and papers and the musty smell of academic labor. She knocked firmly on the door. He opened it almost immediately, tall and slightly stooped, wearing a cardigan with patched elbows and carpet slippers. His face lit up with a friendly smile when he saw her. "Dorothy Harlan, what a pleasant surprise! Come in, come in! How is your mother? I have been meaning to visit. Please, come inside." She stepped into the cramped foyer. It smelled of pipe tobacco and boiled cabbage and old newsprint. "I wanted to talk about your article, Silas. The one in the Journal of Applied Mechanics. I read it this morning. Very impressive work." Silas beamed with pride. His chest puffed out slightly. "Ah, you noticed. Yes, yes." It was a significant undertaking. 4 years of development, really. Painstaking work. Your father, God rest his soul, was a great inspiration to me. We had many conversations, you know. Deep conversations about the fundamentals. He was a true mentor to me, though he would have been too modest to accept that title. I miss our Thursday evenings together terribly. Dorothy nodded slowly, watching his face. A mentor. I see. The formulas in your paper, they are quite sophisticated. Could you show me your working notes? I would love to see how you developed the methodology, the steps you took to arrive at those solutions. I always wondered how engineers do that kind of work. For a moment, Silas's expression froze. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes went flat, calculating. Then the warmth returned, though it seemed forced now. My notes? Well, you know how it is with research. The final paper is always so much cleaner than the process. My working notes are rather disorganized at the moment, scattered across multiple notebooks, full of false starts and abandoned approaches. Not really suitable for viewing, I am afraid. And I am quite pressed for time this week, preparing for next semester's lectures. Perhaps another day? When I have had a chance to organize things properly? Dorothy held his gaze, letting the silence stretch. Of course, Silas. Another day. Whenever it is convenient for you. I would hate to impose. She turned and walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the knob. You know, my father kept very detailed notebooks. Everything dated, every calculation shown step by step. He was meticulous that way. I have been reading through them. Quite fascinating. Silas's face went pale. That is wonderful, Dorothy. A lovely way to remember him. Well, good evening. He closed the door quickly, and she heard the lock turn. The next morning, Dorothy requested a week of leave from the mill, citing a family emergency. Her supervisor, a gruff man named Patterson who had known her father, granted it without question. Take what you need, Dorothy. Family comes first. She took the early train east to Philadelphia, where the national offices of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers were located. The journey took 4 hours, the coach car rattling through the Pennsylvania countryside, past farms and small towns still adjusting to peace after years of war. She sat clutching her handbag, which held her father's notebooks wrapped carefully in a wool scarf, trying to organize her thoughts. She knew proving plagiarism would not be simple. Engineering was a closed world, full of professional courtesies and old boy networks and unwritten rules about deference to seniority. Silas had a doctorate from MIT. He had tenure at a respected institution. He had published dozens of papers over his career. She was a factory girl with a high school diploma and a dead father whose voice could no longer defend his own work. But she had the notebooks. She had dates written in her father's hand. She had his meticulous documentation, his habit of recording everything. That had to count for something. It had to. In Philadelphia, she emerged from 30th Street Station into the gray November afternoon and took a streetcar down Walnut Street. The city felt larger and more imposing than Pittsburgh, its buildings taller, its pace faster. She found the ASME building, a narrow brick structure wedged between a tobacconist and a printing shop, and climbed the stairs to the second floor. The receptionist, a young woman with victory rolls in her hair, directed her to the office of the Ethics Committee. Inside, a middle-aged secretary with graying hair pulled into a tight bun sat behind a desk covered with neat stacks of papers. She looked up as Dorothy entered, her expression polite but professionally distant. "Yes? May I help you?" Dorothy took a breath. "My name is Dorothy Harlan. I'm here to file a formal complaint of plagiarism against Professor Silas Drummond of Carnegie Institute of Technology." The secretary's eyebrows rose slightly. "That is a serious allegation. Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I have evidence." Dorothy opened her handbag and carefully laid the notebooks on the desk. The secretary stared at them for a moment, then gestured to a chair. "Please, sit down. Tell me everything." Dorothy talked for nearly an hour. She explained who her father was, his work at Westinghouse, his friendship with Drummond, his sudden death. She described finding the notebooks, recognizing the equations in Drummond's published article, discovering the pattern of theft that stretched back years. The secretary listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When Dorothy finished, the secretary opened the first notebook and began reading, her finger tracing the lines of calculations. After several minutes, she looked up. "Miss Harlan, you understand the seriousness of what you are claiming. Plagiarism in the engineering profession is not merely an ethical lapse, it is a betrayal of the foundational principles of scholarship. If your allegations are proven true, Professor Drummond's career will be destroyed. His publications will be retracted. His reputation will be ruined. Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared for the possibility that he will fight back, that he will hire lawyers, that he will claim your father was confused, or that you are misremembering?" Dorothy met her gaze steadily. "I understand, but this is my duty. To my father. To the truth. He spent his entire adult life working on these problems. He never sought fame or recognition. He just wanted to solve things, to make things better. And now someone else is taking credit for his life's work. That is wrong. That cannot stand." The secretary closed the notebook and removed her reading glasses. "Very well. I will forward your complaint to the committee. But you should prepare yourself for a lengthy process. There will be a formal investigation. We will need to verify the authenticity of these notebooks through handwriting analysis. We will need to interview witnesses who can testify to your father's work. We will need to obtain documentation from Westinghouse. Professor Drummond will be given the opportunity to respond to the allegations. This could take months, possibly years, and there are no guarantees. The burden of proof is on you. Dorothy nodded. I understand. I am ready. How long before I hear something? The secretary made a note. You should receive a letter within 2 weeks informing you of the committee's decision on whether to proceed with a formal investigation. In the meantime, I would advise you to gather any additional evidence you can find. Letters your father wrote discussing his research, colleagues who remember conversations about these topics, anything that can corroborate your claims. Dorothy stood, gathering the notebooks. Thank you. I will do that. She left the building and walked through the Philadelphia streets as dusk fell, feeling both exhausted and energized. She had started something. There was no turning back now. 2 weeks later, as promised, a letter arrived from Philadelphia. Dorothy found it in the mailbox when she returned from her shift at the mill, her name and address typed on the envelope in official-looking letters. She carried it upstairs to the apartment, her heart pounding. Her mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner, boiling potatoes on the stove. Dorothy sat at the table and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The letter was brief and formal. The ASME Ethics Committee had reviewed her complaint and determined that the allegations were sufficiently serious to warrant a full investigation. A special subcommittee would be convened. The first hearing was scheduled for January 15, 1946. Dorothy was required to appear in person to present her evidence and testify under oath. She read the letter twice, then a third time, making sure she understood every word. What does it say? Her mother asked, not turning from the stove. They are investigating. There will be a hearing in January. I have to go back to Philadelphia. Estelle Harlan turned, spatula in hand. Her face was lined with worry, her eyes tired. Dorothy, honey, are you absolutely sure about this? Silas is a respected man, a professor. He has connections, influence. We are nobody, just working people. What if he gets angry? What if he sues us for defamation? What if he makes it so you cannot find work? Dorothy folded the letter carefully. Mama, Daddy spent 28 years at that plant. 28 years of getting up before dawn, coming home after dark, covered in machine oil and metal dust. He never complained. He never asked for anything. And all that time he was working on these ideas, these brilliant ideas, and he never got to see them published. Now someone is stealing them, taking credit, getting promoted and praised for Daddy's work. I cannot let that stand. I cannot. Estelle sighed and turned back to the stove. I know, honey. I know. You are just like him, stubborn and principled. Do what you think is right. Just please be careful. Over the next 6 weeks, Dorothy prepared for the hearing with the intensity of someone preparing for battle. She requested copies of her father's personnel file from Westinghouse, which included performance reviews praising his innovative approaches to structural problems. She tracked down former colleagues, men who had worked alongside Merritt and could testify to his expertise. 3 agreed to write statements. 1, a senior engineer named Harold Wickham, agreed to travel to Philadelphia to testify in person. He had been her father's closest friend at the plant. I never understood why Merritt did not publish, he told Dorothy when she visited him at his home in Swissvale. He was smarter than half the professors I met during the war doing consulting work. He should have had a doctorate, should have been teaching. But he said he was happy at the bench, happy solving real problems. I guess that made him vulnerable to someone like Drummond. Dorothy also combed through her father's papers at home and found a treasure. A letter Merritt had written to a cousin in 1942, mentioning his work on riveted joints and his hope that the research might help the war effort. The letter was dated, postmarked, indisputable proof that he had been working on these ideas years before Drummond's publications. January 15, 1946. Dorothy returned to Philadelphia on the morning train, dressed in her best suit, carrying a leather portfolio that contained the notebooks, the letters, the statements from her father's colleagues. The hearing took place in a wood-paneled conference room on the third floor of the ASME building. 5 men sat behind a long table, all of them gray-haired, all wearing dark suits and expressions of professional severity. The chairman introduced himself as Dr. Harold Brennan, a professor emeritus from Columbia. To his left and right sat 4 other committee members, their credentials recited in turn. Professors from Penn, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, and Lehigh. Dorothy sat alone at a smaller table facing them, feeling very young and very small. Dr. Brennan spoke in a measured tone. "Miss Harlan, you have made serious allegations against Professor Silas Drummond. We have reviewed your initial complaint. We are here today to examine your evidence in detail. You will present your case, and then Professor Drummond will have an opportunity to respond. We will question both of you. This is not a legal proceeding, but we will conduct it with appropriate seriousness. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Dorothy said. "Please proceed." Dorothy opened her portfolio and began. She spoke clearly and methodically, fighting to keep her voice steady. She presented the notebooks one by one, reading passages aloud, showing the dates, pointing out the distinctive features of her father's handwriting. She displayed Drummond's published article and his conference paper from 1943, laying them side by side with the corresponding notebook pages. She walked the committee through the equations, showing how they matched precisely, how even the notation was identical. She presented the letter to her father's cousin. She read excerpts from the personnel reviews. She explained the timeline, how Drummond had befriended her father in 1940, how he had visited regularly, how her father had shared his work openly, trusting him, how after her father's death, Drummond had offered to preserve his legacy and then had stolen it instead. She spoke for nearly 2 hours. When she finished, the committee members sat in silence, reviewing the materials she had spread before them. Finally, Dr. Brennan looked up. "This is compelling, Miss Harlan, very compelling. But I must ask you a difficult question. How can you be absolutely certain that your father wrote these notebooks? Is it possible that Professor Drummond shared his own preliminary work with your father during their conversations, and your father simply copied it down for his own reference? Is it possible that the intellectual debt runs the other way?" Dorothy had known this question was coming. She had rehearsed her answer a dozen times. She took a breath. First, the dates. My father began these notebooks in 1940. The earliest entry is January 12th of that year. Professor Drummond's first publication on related topics did not appear until 1943. Second, the handwriting. These notebooks are entirely in my father's hand. I can provide additional samples of his writing for comparison. Letters, postcards, grocery lists, anything you need. Third, witnesses. My father discussed this research with colleagues at Westinghouse. Harold Wickham, who is here today, can testify to conversations they had about these exact problems. Fourth, the progression. If you read these notebooks chronologically, you can see my father's thinking evolve. He starts with a hypothesis, tests it, refines it, encounters problems, solves them. This is not someone copying finished work. This is someone doing original research. And fifth, the errors. There are mistakes in these notebooks, dead ends, calculations that my father crossed out and redid. Those same errors do not appear in Professor Drummond's publications because he had the benefit of seeing the final, corrected versions. One of the committee members, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward. "You mentioned a witness?" "Yes, sir. Harold Wickham worked with my father for 15 years. Dr. Brennan nodded. "We will hear from him. Send him in." Harold Wickham was a stocky man in his 60s with calloused hands and a forthright manner. He took the seat Dorothy vacated and answered the committee's questions with blunt honesty. "Yes," he said, "Merritt talked about this work all the time. We would have lunch together in the plant cafeteria, and he would sketch ideas on napkins. Stress distributions, failure modes, ways to make joints stronger without adding weight. He was obsessed with it. Did he ever mention Silas Drummond? Wickham nodded. Sure. Merritt said Drummond was a smart fellow, good to talk things through with. But Merritt was always the one doing the talking. Drummond would ask questions, take notes. I met him once, when he came by the plant to pick Merritt up for dinner. Seemed like a hanger-on to me, if I'm being honest. The kind of academic who does not get his hands dirty. Did Merritt ever express any intention to publish this work himself? Wickham shook his head sadly. No. That was the tragedy. Merritt always said he did not have the credentials, that no journal would take him seriously. He said maybe someday he would write it all up, submit it somewhere, but he never got around to it. He was too busy actually doing the work to worry about taking credit for it. After Wickham finished, the committee excused Dorothy and called Silas Drummond. Dorothy waited in the hallway, pacing, unable to sit still. An hour passed. 2 hours. Finally, the door opened and Dr. Brennan stepped out. Miss Harlan, you may go home. We will deliberate and inform you of our decision in writing. The process may take some time. We appreciate your patience. How long? She asked. Dr. Brennan hesitated. These matters are complex. 90 days, perhaps longer. We will be thorough. Dorothy nodded and left. On the train back to Pittsburgh, she stared out the window at the passing landscape and tried not to hope too much. The winter of 1946 was brutal. Snow fell in heavy blankets, and the streets of Pittsburgh became rivers of gray slush. Dorothy worked her shifts at the mill, came home, helped her mother with cooking and cleaning, and waited. Every day she checked the mail. Every day there was nothing. In March, Silas Drummond stopped acknowledging her in the hallway. Previously, he had at least nodded when they passed on the stairs. Now he looked through her as though she were invisible. One evening, she returned home to find scratches around the lock on her apartment door, fresh gouges in the brass plate. The next day, the kitchen window had a crack, a small, starred fracture in the lower pane. Her mother was terrified. "It is him," Estelle whispered. "He is trying to scare us. He wants us to drop this." Dorothy said nothing, but she started carrying her father's wrench in her purse when she walked home from work in the dark. In April, finally, a letter arrived. Thick envelope, official seal. Dorothy's hands shook as she opened it. The committee had completed its preliminary investigation. The handwriting analysis was unequivocal. The notebooks were written by Merritt Harlan, not copied from another source. The dates were authentic, verified by ink analysis and paper aging. The committee had also obtained records from Westinghouse, including minutes from technical review meetings held between 1940 and 1944. Multiple entries reference presentations by Merritt Harlan on topics directly related to the content of the notebooks. The evidence, the letter stated, strongly supported Dorothy's allegations. However, Professor Drummond had submitted a detailed rebuttal, and fairness required that his version be fully considered. A second hearing would be scheduled for June. Both parties would be required to attend. Dorothy read the letter to her mother that evening. Estelle listened in silence, her face unreadable. When Dorothy finished, her mother said quietly, "He will fight, you know. Men like that always do. They never admit they are wrong." Dorothy folded the letter. "I know, Mama, but the truth is on our side. It has to count for something." Estelle reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Your father would be proud of you. You know that, do not you?" Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back. "I hope so. I really hope so." The second hearing in June was longer and more contentious. Silas Drummond arrived with a lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Pemberton, who specialized in academic disputes. Drummond's defense was carefully constructed. He acknowledged that he had had extensive conversations with Merritt Harlan, that they had discussed engineering problems together, that Merritt had been a valued friend and informal collaborator. But, he argued, the ideas had emerged from their joint discussions. Merritt had intuitions, flashes of insight, but lacked the mathematical training to develop them rigorously. Silas claimed that he had taken Merritt's rough concepts and refined them, formalized them, made them publishable. The work, he insisted, was collaborative in spirit, if not in formal authorship, and since Merritt lacked a doctorate and had never expressed interest in publishing, it had been natural and appropriate for Silas to present the results under his own name. He framed himself as Merritt's champion, the man who had elevated factory floor insights into legitimate scholarship. It was a clever argument, and watching the committee's faces, Dorothy felt a spike of fear that they might believe it. But then the committee presented its own findings. Dr. Brennan, speaking in his dry, professorial tone, noted that the committee had reviewed all of Drummond's publications from the past 15 years. They had discovered a troubling pattern. Before 1940, the year Drummond began visiting Merritt Harlan regularly, his publication record was sparse and undistinguished. 4 papers in minor journals, none of them particularly innovative. After 1940, his productivity increased dramatically. Between 1941 and 1944, he published 9 papers, several in prestigious venues, on topics ranging from welded joints to fatigue analysis to thermal stress. After Merritt's death in late 1944, there was an explosion. 2 major articles in 1945, a book chapter under contract, invitations to speak at national conferences. Dr. Brennan displayed a chart showing this timeline. The correlation between Drummond's access to Harlan and Drummond's scholarly output, he said, is statistically striking. We also note that after Mr. Harlan's death, Professor Drummond's publications drew heavily on topics documented in the notebooks that he, by his own admission, took from the Harlan residence. This pattern is consistent with appropriation, not collaboration. Drummond's lawyer objected, argued, demanded that the chart be stricken as prejudicial. But the damage was done. The committee pressed Drummond on specifics. Could he produce his own working notes for the 1945 paper? He claimed they had been lost in a move. Could he explain the identical notation, the identical errors corrected in the same way? He stammered that coincidences happen, that there are only so many ways to express certain relationships. Could he name any other colleagues with whom he had collaborated in this informal way? He could not. By the end of the day, Silas Drummond looked pale and defeated. The committee announced that it would deliberate and issue a final ruling within 90 days. Dorothy returned to Pittsburgh emotionally drained. The summer of 1946 was hot and humid, the kind of weather that made the steel mills even more hellish than usual. She worked her shifts, sweat soaking through her clothes, and tried not to think about the hearing. But at night she lay awake, replaying the arguments, wondering if she had said enough, done enough. Her mother tried to comfort her, but Estelle was struggling with her own grief, her own loneliness. Merritt had been dead for nearly 2 years, and the apartment still felt empty without him. In early September, the final letter arrived. Dorothy was at work when it came, but her mother was waiting when she got home, holding the envelope. Dorothy took it with shaking hands, sat down at the kitchen table, and read. The ASME Ethics Committee had reached its decision. After careful review of all evidence and testimony, the committee found that Professor Silas Drummond had knowingly and deliberately appropriated the unpublished research of Merritt Harlan without proper attribution. The appropriation constituted plagiarism as defined by the ASME Code of Ethics. As a result, the following actions were mandated. Drummond's article in the Journal of Applied Mechanics would be retracted. He would be required to issue a public apology acknowledging Merritt Harlan's contributions. He would be barred from publishing in ASME journals for a period of 5 years. Additionally, the committee would forward its findings to Carnegie Institute of Technology with a recommendation that Drummond's tenure status be reviewed. Dorothy read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Her mother stood behind her, hands on her shoulders, crying too. "We did it," Estelle whispered. "Oh, Merritt, we did it." But Silas Drummond was not finished. Within a week, his lawyer filed motions in Pennsylvania state court seeking to block enforcement of the ASME ruling. Pemberton argued that the ASME was a private professional organization with no legal authority to impose sanctions, that its ethics committee was an advisory body, not a court of law, that the proceedings had denied Drummond due process. He sought an injunction preventing the retraction and demanding that the committee's findings be sealed. Dorothy, with no money for a lawyer, was forced to represent herself. She spent evenings at the Carnegie Library in Oakland, reading law books, copying out relevant precedents in longhand, trying to understand procedures and jurisdictional questions. A sympathetic clerk at the Allegheny County Courthouse, an older woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who had lost her own son in the war, helped Dorothy file her responses. "You are doing the right thing, honey," Mrs. Kowalski told her. "Do not let them bully you." The case went before Judge Raymond Foster in December 1946. Dorothy stood at a table in the courtroom, facing Pemberton across the aisle, and argued that the ASME had every right to enforce its own ethical standards, that membership in the organization was voluntary and carried obligations, that Drummond had agreed to abide by its rules when he joined. She presented the committee's findings, the evidence, the testimony. Pemberton countered with procedural objections and claims of bias. Judge Foster, a stern man in his 60s, listened to both sides and then took the matter under advisement. His ruling came in late January 1947. The court upheld the ASME's findings and denied Drummond's motion for an injunction. Professional organizations, the judge wrote, have the authority to regulate the conduct of their members. The Ethics Committee followed appropriate procedures. Mr. Drummond has not demonstrated any basis for judicial intervention. Dorothy received a copy of the ruling in the mail and collapsed into a chair, weak with relief. But Drummond appealed to the state appellate court. The process started over. More briefs, more hearings, more waiting. Dorothy continued working at the mill, continued checking the mail, continued living in a state of suspended anxiety. The case dragged through 1947 and into 1948. During this time, something unexpected happened. The Pittsburgh Press ran a feature story about the case. A young reporter named Margaret Shaw had heard about it through the courthouse grapevine and had interviewed Dorothy at length. The article appeared on a Sunday in March 1947 with the headline, "Factory Girl Fights Professor Over Dead Father's Stolen Ideas." It was a long piece, 2 full pages, with a photograph of Dorothy holding one of her father's notebooks. The story was sympathetic, portraying Dorothy as an underdog fighting for justice against an entitled academic. It described Merritt Harlan as a self-taught genius, a working-class hero whose brilliance had been exploited. The response was overwhelming. Letters began arriving at Dorothy's apartment, dozens of them, from people across Pittsburgh and beyond. Engineers wrote to share their own stories of being overlooked or cheated. Working people wrote to express solidarity. Women wrote to say they were inspired by her courage. Several letters contained small checks, $5, $10, contributions toward legal costs. One letter came from a retired Westinghouse engineer named Albert Rossini, who had worked alongside Merritt in the 1930s. "I remember your father well," Rossini wrote. "He was the smartest man in the building, but he never put on airs. He helped me solve a problem with a turbine bearing once, probably saved the company $50,000, and he never asked for anything in return. I always wondered why he did not move up, why he stayed on the floor. Now I understand. He was too busy actually working to play politics. What happened to him is a crime." Dorothy replied to every letter, thanking each person, feeling buoyed by the outpouring of support. She was not alone in this fight. She represented something larger than herself. In April 1948, the appellate court issued its ruling. In a unanimous decision, the 3-judge panel affirmed the lower court. The ASME's findings stood. Drummond was ordered to comply with the sanctions. His article was formally retracted in the June 1948 issue of the Journal of Applied Mechanics. The retraction notice was brief, a single paragraph buried on page 47, acknowledging that the work had been based substantially on unpublished research by the late Merritt Harlan and that proper attribution had not been given. Drummond's name remained on the article, but now with an asterisk leading to the correction. It was unsatisfying, incomplete, but it was something. Dorothy cut out the notice and pasted it into a scrapbook she had started, a record of the fight. Her mother cried when she saw it. "Merritt would be so proud," Estelle said, her voice breaking. "So proud." But Dorothy wanted more. The retraction was a correction, an admission of error, but it did not restore her father's name to the work itself. She wrote to the journal's editor, a professor at Stanford named Dr. Eugene Hartley, requesting that the article be republished with Merritt Harlan listed as the primary author. Drummond, she argued, had contributed nothing original. He had merely transcribed and organized her father's work. At most, he deserved credit as an editor, not as an author. Dr. Hartley's response was polite but firm. The journal did not publish posthumous works except in extraordinary circumstances, and even then only when the deceased author's intent to publish could be clearly established. Since Merritt Harlan had never submitted the work himself, and since he was no longer alive to verify the content or approve the presentation, the journal could not in good conscience publish it under his name. "It is a matter of editorial policy and intellectual honesty," Dr. Hartley wrote. "I am sympathetic to your situation, but I cannot make an exception." Dorothy was furious. She fired back a letter pointing out the absurdity. Her father's work was honest enough to justify retracting Drummond's article, but not honest enough to publish under his own name? Dr. Hartley did not reply. Frustrated, Dorothy decided to go around the gatekeepers. She began contacting smaller publications, trade journals, regional engineering newsletters. She wrote her own article, a 6-page piece titled "The Stolen Equations of Merritt Harlan," which recounted the plagiarism case and reproduced 3 key derivations from her father's notebooks, presented exactly as he had written them. She submitted it to a dozen outlets. Most rejected it, citing editorial policies or lack of space. But one, the Bulletin of the Industrial Engineering Society, a scrappy quarterly published out of Cleveland, agreed to run it. The article appeared in the spring 1949 issue. It was not a prestigious venue, but it reached working engineers, the people who might actually use her father's methods. And it put Merritt Harlan's name into the published record, finally, as an author. The article sparked conversations. Dorothy began receiving invitations to speak at local ASME chapters, at union halls, at vocational schools. The first invitation came from the Western Pennsylvania chapter of ASME, asking her to present at their monthly meeting in May 1949. She accepted nervously, unsure what to say or how to say it. But when she stood before an audience of 60 engineers, mostly men twice her age, and told her father's story, they listened in rapt silence. She showed them the notebooks. She explained the equations. She talked about the theft and the fight for justice. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Men came up afterward to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her she was doing important work. One older engineer, a man with white hair and kind eyes, said, "Your father was lucky to have you. Most of us, when we die, our work dies with us. You brought him back." Emboldened, Dorothy accepted more speaking invitations. She traveled to Youngstown, to Cleveland, to Akron, always by bus, always on her own dime. She spoke to anyone who would listen. Her message was simple. Engineering was not just about calculations and materials. It was about integrity. It was about giving credit where credit was due. It was about standing up for the truth, even when it was hard. Audiences responded. The story of Merritt Harlan became a parable, a cautionary tale about plagiarism and exploitation, but also an inspiring story about persistence and justice. In 1950, Carnegie Institute of Technology quietly declined to renew Silas Drummond's tenure. The official reason given was budgetary constraints and restructuring in the engineering department. But everyone who followed the case knew the truth. Drummond left Pittsburgh that summer. Dorothy heard through the grapevine that he had taken a position at a tire company in Akron, working as a technical writer, producing product manuals and safety specifications. He never published another scholarly article. For Dorothy, this felt like vindication. The man who had stolen her father's work had been brought down, his academic career destroyed. She felt no joy in his ruin, but she felt justice had been served. Yet, Even as she savored this victory, Dorothy felt something else, a gnawing sense of unfinished business. Her father's name had been cleared, but his work remained incomplete. He had died with so many ideas still undeveloped, so many problems unsolved. And Dorothy, who was not an engineer, could not carry them forward. Or could she? The thought had been growing in her mind for months. She was 29 years old. She had a steady job, some savings, no dependents except her aging mother. What if she went back to school? What if she became an engineer herself? It seemed absurd. Women did not do that. Engineering school was for men, for boys fresh out of high school with scholarships and family support. But the war had changed things. Women had worked in factories, had built planes and ships, had proven they could do technical work. Maybe it was not so absurd after all. She started cautiously, enrolling in a night class at the University of Pittsburgh in the fall of 1950. Introduction to Mechanical Engineering. The instructor was a young professor named Dr. Lawrence Keene, recently returned from military service. There were 20 students in the class, 19 men and Dorothy. The men stared at her the first night, some curious, some hostile. One, a cocky kid in a varsity jacket, asked loudly, "Did you take a wrong turn, sweetheart? The home economics class is downstairs." Dorothy ignored him, took a seat in the front row, and opened her notebook. Dr. Keene treated her no differently than the men, which she appreciated. The coursework was hard, harder than anything she had done in high school, but she had spent years reading her father's notebooks, absorbing his explanations, and some of it had stuck. She finished the class with the highest grade. Encouraged, she took more classes: statics, dynamics, strength of materials. She worked during the day at the mill and studied at night, sleeping 5 hours if she was lucky. Her mother worried. "You are going to make yourself sick, Dorothy. Why are you doing this?" "Because Daddy could not," Dorothy replied. By 1953, she had earned enough credits for an associate degree in engineering technology. It was not a full bachelor's degree, but it was something. She applied to the 4-year engineering program at Pitt. The admissions committee was skeptical. A woman in her 30s with no high school physics, no calculus, just night classes and determination? But her grades were perfect, and her story was compelling. They admitted her on probation. She quit her job at the mill, depleted her savings, and enrolled full-time in the fall of 1953. She was 32 years old, a decade older than the freshmen in her classes. The young men did not know what to make of her. Some ignored her. Some mocked her. A few, the ones who were serious about learning, respected her. She studied ferociously, lived on coffee and cheap sandwiches, and graduated in May 1956 with a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering, ranked 3rd in her class. At the commencement ceremony, walking across the stage to receive her diploma, she thought, "This is for you, Daddy. I finished what you started." After graduation, Dorothy sent applications to a dozen companies. Most never replied. A few sent polite rejections, but Westinghouse, her father's employer, offered her an interview. The hiring manager, a man named Donald Fraser, who had worked with Merritt, remembered her father fondly. "Merritt Harlan was one of the best engineers I ever knew," Fraser told her. "If you have even half his talent, you will do fine here." She was hired into the research division, working on turbine blade design for power generation. It was challenging work, cutting-edge stuff, and Dorothy thrived. Her supervisors quickly recognized her abilities. She was detail-oriented, creative, unafraid to challenge conventional approaches. Within 2 years, she was leading a small team developing new analytical methods for predicting blade fatigue under high-temperature operation. It was work her father would have loved. In 1959, Dorothy published her first paper in the Transactions of the ASME. The title was A Generalized Approach to Fatigue Prediction in Welded Structures, and it was based directly on her father's 1942 notebook. She listed 2 authors, Dorothy Harlan and Merritt Harlan, in that order. In the acknowledgments section, she wrote, This work builds on the unpublished research of my late father, Merritt Harlan, whose contributions to the field of structural mechanics were unjustly obscured. I dedicate this paper to his memory and to the principle that truth, though delayed, will ultimately prevail. The editor, a different man now, allowed it without objection. The paper was well received. It was cited in follow-up studies, referenced in graduate-level textbooks, incorporated into industry standards. Merritt Harlan's name was now in the literature, not as a victim or a footnote, but as an engineer whose work mattered. Dorothy kept a framed copy of the first page on her office wall. In 1962, Dorothy met Vincent Collier at an ASME conference in Detroit. He was a structural engineer from Cleveland, quiet and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor and a deep respect for rigor. They talked for hours over coffee, discovering shared interests and compatible temperaments. He was not intimidated by her intelligence or her story. He admired both. They married in a small ceremony in June, her mother weeping happily, and settled into a modest house in Shadyside. Vincent supported her career without reservation, took pride in her accomplishments, shared the domestic work equally. They did not have children, a decision they made together, both feeling their work was their legacy. Dorothy continued at Westinghouse, continued publishing, continued building her reputation. In 1967, she completed a master's degree at Carnegie Mellon, the institution that had once employed Silas Drummond. There was a symmetry to that she found satisfying. In 1971, at 50 years old, she began a doctoral program. Her dissertation, defended in 1974 when she was 53, the exact age her father had been when he died, was on fracture mechanics in pressure vessel design. The work extended her father's original insights about stress distribution into new domains. At her defense, one of her committee members, an elderly professor named Whitaker who had been on the original ASME ethics committee that vindicated her father, said, "Dr. Harlan, your father would have been extraordinarily proud, not just of your scholarship, but of your character." She thanked him, unable to speak further through her tears. As Dr. Dorothy Harlan, she became a leading figure in mechanical engineering. She joined editorial boards, served on professional committees, consulted for major companies. But she never forgot where she came from or what she had fought for. In every lecture, every paper, every conversation with students and young engineers, she emphasized integrity. Give credit, document your work, stand up for what is right. She became known as a fierce advocate for ethical conduct, someone who did not tolerate plagiarism or exploitation. Once, at a conference in Chicago in 1976, a graduate student approached her during a coffee break. "Dr. Harlan, I need advice. My advisor is putting his name on my papers even though he did not contribute. What should I do?" Dorothy took the young woman aside and talked with her for an hour, sharing her own story, outlining practical steps, offering to help if needed. "Document everything," she said. "Keep copies of all your work. If you need to fight, fight. Do not let him steal your future." In 1978, Dorothy retired from Westinghouse at 57, but retirement was a technicality. She immediately took a position as an adjunct professor at the University of Pittsburgh, teaching mechanical design and a special seminar she created called Engineering Ethics and Professional Responsibility. The ethics seminar became her passion. She devoted an entire week to the Merritt Harlan case, assigning students to read court transcripts, ASME rulings, technical papers, even her father's original notebooks, which she had donated to the university library. Students would debate the case from every angle: legal, ethical, professional. Dorothy would facilitate, challenge assumptions, force them to think deeply. At the end, she would ask, "What is the lesson?" Students would offer responses. Integrity matters, power corrupts, justice is possible. Dorothy would nod. All true. But here is the deeper truth. When someone steals your work, they are not just stealing ideas or words. They are stealing your life, your time, your passion, your identity. And you have a responsibility to yourself, to your profession, to truth itself, to fight back. Not with bitterness, but with evidence. Not with rage, but with persistence. Because truth delayed is not truth denied. Remember that. In 1982, Dorothy published a book. She had been working on it for over a decade, compiling documents, interviewing her father's surviving colleagues, reconstructing the story of his life and work. The book was titled Merritt Harlan, Engineer, Inventor, Stolen Genius. It was part biography, part technical history, part personal memoir. It told the story of Merritt's childhood in rural Pennsylvania, the son of a coal miner, his aptitude for mathematics and mechanics, his education at a trade school, his long career at Westinghouse. It detailed his research, his innovations, his notebooks, and it told the story of the theft, the fight, the vindication. The book was published by a small academic press and sold modestly, but it received widespread critical attention. Engineering magazines praised it as an important contribution to the history of the profession. The New York Times ran a brief review. The Washington Post published a feature article headlined, "The Daughter Who Refused to Let Her Father Be Forgotten." Dorothy appeared on local television, on radio programs, at book signings. She told her story over and over, never tiring of it. Because it was not just her story. It was a story about justice, about integrity, about the power of ordinary people to stand up against institutional injustice. In 1985, the ASME established an annual award in her father's name, the Merritt Harlan Award for Ethical Conduct in Engineering. It would be given each year to an engineer who demonstrated exceptional integrity in the face of professional challenges. Dorothy was invited to present the inaugural award at the National Conference in Boston. She stood at the podium before 2,000 engineers, holding the bronze plaque, and spoke about her father. About his genius, his humility, his betrayal, his vindication. About the fight for justice that had consumed decades of her life. About the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible. She spoke for 20 minutes, her voice strong and clear, and when she finished, the entire auditorium rose in a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. She stood there, tears streaming down her face, and thought, "This is what justice looks like. This is what redemption feels like." In 1990, Vincent died suddenly of a stroke. He was 68. They had been married 28 years. Dorothy buried him in Allegheny Cemetery, not far from her parents. She stood at the graveside in the cold rain, watching the casket lowered into the earth, and felt the weight of accumulated loss. Her father, her mother, now her husband. All the people who had anchored her life were gone. She returned to the empty house in Shadyside and wondered how to go on. But she had her work. She had her students. She had her mission. In the years after Vincent's death, she threw herself into teaching and writing with renewed intensity. She published a second edition of her book, expanded with newly discovered correspondence between her father and his colleagues. She gave lectures at universities across the country. She became a fixture at engineering conferences, an elder stateswoman whom younger engineers approached with a mix of reverence and curiosity. In 1991, Dorothy received a brief obituary clipped from the Akron Beacon Journal, mailed anonymously. Silas Drummond had died at 93. The notice was sparse: early academic career, later work in industry, survived by a daughter and 2 grandchildren. No mention of plagiarism, of Merritt Harlan, of disgrace. Dorothy read it sitting at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. She felt nothing. No triumph, no vindication, no closure. Just a vast emptiness. The man was dead. The fight was over. She folded the clipping and put it in a drawer and never looked at it again. In 2000, Dorothy turned 79. She was still teaching 1 course per semester, still sharp mentally but physically frail. Her knees ached, her hands shook, she tired easily. She walked with a cane. After a lecture one afternoon, a student approached her. "Professor Harlan, can I ask you something personal?" She nodded. Do you ever regret it? Spending your whole life fighting for your father? Do you wish you had just let it go? Dorothy looked at him steadily. Regret? Never. Not for 1 second. I gave my father back his name, his dignity, his truth. That was my life's purpose, and I am proud of it. The student thanked her and left. Dorothy stood alone in the empty classroom, gathering her papers, and felt at peace. In 2005, Dorothy gave her final public lecture at Carnegie Mellon. The auditorium was packed. She spoke for an hour about the history of engineering ethics, about her father, about the fight. The applause was thunderous. Afterward, a long line of people waited to speak with her, to shake her hand, to have her sign their books. It was late when she finally returned home. She sat in her living room, looking out at the darkened street, thinking about the journey from that November day in 1945, when she first opened her father's notebook, to this moment 60 years later. She thought about all the people she had met, all the students she had taught, all the lives she had touched. And she thought, I did what I was supposed to do. I kept my promise. Dorothy Harlan died in her sleep on a cold February morning in 2008. She was 86. Her obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was long and detailed, recounting her life, her career, her crusade. The headline read, "Engineer who fought for decades to restore father's legacy dies at 86." Her funeral was held at the church where she had married Vincent. The pews were filled with former students, colleagues, friends. One of her doctoral students, now a professor himself, gave the eulogy. He spoke about her brilliance, her tenacity, her unwavering commitment to truth. He said, "Dorothy Harlan taught us that one person, armed with courage and evidence, can change the world. She taught us that integrity is not negotiable. She taught us that justice, though delayed, is always worth fighting for." As her casket was carried from the church, the bells tolled in the cold air. She was buried beside Vincent, her parents nearby. Her headstone read simply, Dorothy Harlan, 1921 to 2008. Engineer, teacher, defender of truth. Her legacy endures. The Merritt Harlan Award is still given annually. Her book remains in print, assigned in ethics courses nationwide. Her papers are archived at the University of Pittsburgh. In 2010, an MIT graduate student wrote a dissertation on plagiarism in 20th century engineering, devoting a full chapter to the Harlan-Drummond case. In 2015, a documentary titled Stolen Equations aired on PBS, telling the story to a national audience. The film prompted engineering societies to strengthen their ethics codes and create better protections against plagiarism. Today, 80 years after Dorothy first discovered the theft, Merritt Harlan's name is known to every engineering student in America. His equations are taught in textbooks. His story is a touchstone. And Dorothy Harlan is remembered not just as her father's champion, but as a pioneer, a woman who broke barriers, who fought injustice, who changed her profession. Every year, students at Pitt visit her grave, leave flowers, tell her story to newcomers. They carry forward the lesson she spent her life teaching, that truth matters, that justice is worth the fight, that memory is sacred, that we honor the past not with words, but with action. Dorothy Harlan knew this. She lived it. And her legacy, like her father's, will endure forever.